Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay, Xander?
Yep.
Okay. Of course, as things happen, I think the next building over, they're starting new construction. So tell me if I need to try to buffer that or if it becomes if you can hear it in the background, I do apologize. It always happens right when you're about to do a webinar. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So I have been at the California Fire Science Consortium for about 3 years now, and it's great because like Xander mentioned, for his Southwest region, we do a lot of the same things, which means my job is diverse and always changing and moving, and it's really enjoyable. But today, I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about the work I did for my master's degree and work that the same team did on the science of smoke, the social science aspect of smoke. So just a brief outline of what the talk's going to be. I wanted to pull a few pieces from smoke literature that we knew before we started this study that we really built on, and then of course talk about why why smoke is important, the barriers, the issues involved with that. And then I'll be spending the majority of this time on this 3-stage social science project that was all based around smoke. In general, it was a project that we kind of used each stage to do on the first. So we started with interviews, we used those to inform surveys, and then we used those to do kind of a final test of the messaging to see what was working best based on the information we learned. And then I do want to take a couple minutes at the end there to mention some of the other projects around smoke science that might be interested. And most of these projects are complete, so we have published papers, and I will be sure to send the links to the Southwest coordinators so that they can include an email if you want to read more on the actual journal articles and get more in depth into the studies. So jumping on. So background. I'm sure I saw a lot of you guys are federal managers. You probably know the issues with smoke. But, for all the smoke that we're experiencing as a society each summer and kind of throughout the year, especially in California, we have pretty much all year-round fire season, which means year-round smoke season. We still actually have a lot to learn about the smoke exposure and how it affects human health. We do know a lot already. We know that the really small particles, those that are less than 2.5, are the ones that are really detrimental to our bodies. We know that smoke can contain carcinogenic and other harmful chemicals that can affect our bodies in lots of negative ways, especially long-term exposure. And we know that certain population groups are at higher risk. So those include people with heart or lung issues that already exist, elderly, children, and anyone who's pregnant. And these studies, we are already starting to have some good studies coming out of, we're learning more about smoke, especially from wildfire. In the past, we've looked at just smoke as smoke, and now we're seeing that there are differences between smoke produced from, say, a prescribed fire and a wildfire. There are new studies that are coming out that try to estimate the cost of what this health impact is. So there's one that came out in 2017 by Jones and Barron, and they took the average cost from 2005 to 2015, and they estimated that in just the Western U.S., the impacts of health and morbidity is causing about $165 million in damages a year. So it's definitely a big impact for all, even if you're just talking to someone who says it's a nuisance, it can go all the way up to actually leading to hospitalization or even death. And we also know that beyond just the health aspects of smoke, there's other issues it can create. So transportation, tourism. A lot of the communities that we'll be talking about today rely pretty heavily on tourism as part of their local economy. So when things get shut down, people don't want to go because it's smoky. They go someplace else. That does affect their local economies indirectly too. And even just for the ability of people to be able to go outside, outdoors, during those warm, wonderful summer months and play outside. So just wanted to point out, so I put this picture of Shasta Dam there. You can see on the top, it's just bright, beautiful. You can see forever, and then you see the smoke impact, and you can hardly see the dam. It's taken from about the same location. But it's something like most of us who live in areas with fire, we see this impact of smoke on our visibility, and you can see how that could influence tourism, not to mention what that might do to your cough or your throat itching, all that sort of thing. But on the other side of that, aside from all the negative impacts of smoke to the population, we know that there's ecosystems throughout this country that are fire adapted, meaning that when we have an absence of fire, it harms not just the ecological functions of the ecosystems, but it can create a higher risk for future or large, high-severity fires that have all these additional negative impacts to both humans and the ecosystems. And then some of these ecosystems need really frequent fire, like this image from South Carolina. So this is about 3 years after a prescribed burn was done in there, and you can see there's already a lot of stuff that if we put fire back in, right at this, when this picture was taken, it would still be able to probably go through and clean up a lot of stuff. So some of these areas, they need fire very frequently, and they have years and years of a deficit. And we also know that there's a lot of different reasons why managers are having a hard time getting fire back on the ground, or even other treatments like fuels, thinning projects. But one of them that is often stated is that smoke is creating a barrier to getting the work done. Whether this is, just the social acceptability, they don't want to have people complaining about smoke, or it's really hard to meet within the regulations what you need to have done and the conditions, the right weather conditions and air conditions in order to be able to do a prescribed burn. So, and I can list a number of sources that state how just both the public and the managers are saying smoke is a really big, important barrier to getting fire restored on the ecosystem. So with that, that led this group of researchers to look at not just smoke in general, but also specifically at the social side of smoke. There was some previous studies that have been done on smoke prior to this project. A lot of times they were just 1 or 2 questions included in a study that looked more at like prescribed fire and field treatments. So, but from that we did learn that there was a few key points that we kind of built into our research. First of all, as mentioned before, smoke does seem to be a concern for most citizens, and it seems that the acceptance of smoke and how acceptable it is really conditional on a number of different things, especially the smoke, especially the smoke origin, so the type of fire it was coming from, and also it can be conditional on the understanding of the person who is stating that. So if it's someone who thinks prescribed fire has a lot of benefits, they may be seeing smoke differently than somebody who doesn't understand why you would want to light the forest on fire. And then, of course, we also know that respiratory ailments like asthma, COPD, and other lung diseases affect about 1/3 of the U.S. population. So that means that there's a significant number of people in our country that are dealing with health issues that can be exacerbated or made worse by smoke. And so one of the focuses of this project throughout was kind of if the trade-off between having wildfire smoke, which is this kind of uncontrollable, we're trying to suppress it, but it's a big surge in smoke that can hang around a long time, versus prescribed fire smoke that is pretty well planned, and oftentimes the whole reason it's allowed is because that smoke is going to be carried away from a population center. So kind of the trade-offs between more smoke now, as in with the prescribed fire, but less over the long term over the course of a year because of reduction in the severity or intensity of wildfires. And I do also want to note that I know there's at least one project that is looking at the difference between toxicity levels of smoke based on how it's burning and what it's burning. So looking at things like prescribed fire versus wildfire and how that's actually affecting the chemical composition of smoke, which would then affect the health of humans and populations. So that's kind of the background just a little bit, and I'll mention at the end too, but I know there is a smoke science synthesis that's coming out of the Northwest Fire Science Consortium that looks at all of these studies that we have so far about smoke and social science and kind of pulls points that we need to look at and also what we found thus far. So jumping into the actual project, this is just kind of so this is a multi-region, multi-stage analysis of fire and smoke issues. So we did 4 different sites, and these were selected specifically to get a diverse set of ecosystems, management styles, and also to include areas that were next to a national forest that had kind of a lower, more rural areas and also more of an urban with denser populations. So these 4 study sites were the Shasta Trinity National Forest, so this included towns like Redding for more of our urban, I know quote-unquote urban if you're familiar with the area, and then a bunch of smaller communities, the Fremont-Manima in southern Oregon, the northwestern corner of Montana near the Kootenai National Forest, and in South Carolina, the Francis Marion National Forest. So the first stage of this was the semi-structured interviews. This was led by a grad student, Danny Mazzata, and the resulting publication is Communicating About Smoke from Wildland Fire, Challenges and Ways to Address Them, and that can be found online. I'll make sure to include a link to that paper in the follow-up email, I think is how we're going to get these out. And so the research team first, they were the ones who actually decided which study areas they wanted to look at, and then they conducted in-person interviews. These were typically done with individuals, but also some kind of smaller groups. This is the number of people that they talked to. So there were 60 interviews total. You can see the majority of people were from federal, state, or local agencies, and then kind of a nice diverse smattering of air quality, local fire protection, timber industries, some NGOs, and private landowners. And so some of the findings from this, first off, they asked about communication tools and strategies. And there was a really wide range of what people were doing to try to communicate with the public about smoke. Most commonly, so across the board, the most common tools in these different areas were radio announcements, websites, hotlines, and public meetings. And so, for example, how we build on these projects, the list that came from this interview set, we put into the next set, which was the questionnaires or the surveys that we sent out, and had people rate these different tools for usefulness so we could provide feedback to the people we interviewed and say, hey, so I know you're really, you're using hotlines a lot, but that's really not useful or something like that, just to kind of provide some feedback for the people who are kind enough to interview with us. For interagency communications, so not just with the public, but talking about how these different groups work together, the most commonly discussed ways to communicate were through more of this collaborative or facilitated groups. And it was typically mentioned that sometimes these groups started as informal relationships or conversations based on a common interest, and then that later became more of a working partnership. And oftentimes these groups, the more successful ones especially, tended to include multiple agencies or affiliations. Barriers to communications that came up during this included uncertainty about the effectiveness of these communication strategies. So managers were saying, we're doing these things, we're not sure how effective they actually are. There was also the sense that there was inconsistent messaging by different agencies, and that might be causing confusion. Based, for the general public, they're not maybe sure who to listen to because these messages are different. And then finally, it was stated that there might be a higher internal priority for other activities than just communicating with stakeholders. So finally, the project kind of tried to address these in some pretty simple ways to maybe improve these areas or these barriers or challenges, which was improving relationship with smoke-affected public, reprioritizing communication efforts, and an emphasis on consistent and coordinated smoke and communication management. And I will say that in a lot of these areas, they were already on, a really great start of having these groups coming together and talking within the agencies, so that, they were doing this more of, they were calling each other up saying, hey, we're going to do a burn today. What's the weather? What's the air quality? Are you doing a burn today? Like that kind of communication, but it wouldn't take much to then come up with some consistent messaging so that they all kind of had a guideline to work within. All right, jumping on to stage 2. So that was the first one. They went and they did these interviews. They took all those, analyzed them, got some results back. And then the next stage, and this was the stage that I initially came on with, was these questionnaires. So it was a pretty long questionnaire. It was about 7 pages, and it included a variety of things. We were working with a pretty big research group to try and talk to just a whole span of smoke and fuels and agency relationship issues. And we did this, we did a random population study in all those 4 sites that I mentioned before. And again, so this is kind of what spawned the whole webinar. Was we recently, this last year, came out with a paper which was a multi-region analysis of factors that affect public acceptance of smoke from different fire sources. And that's one of the publications that came out of this survey. So I'll probably be spending most of my time in this stage 2. So I won't go too much into the methods. I try to keep this really short. I know we all are more interested in the results, but if you do want more information, that's all within the paper. This was a modified Dillman approach, which means we sent out through the mail a postcard saying, hey, we're going to send you a survey, sending you the survey, and then sending you reminders to try and get as many people as we could to fill out the survey and send it back. We originally sent over about 4,000, and we got 992 back, which was an average response rate of 23%, and this varied between 13%, which was South Carolina, with the high of 33%, which was Montana. in most cases, so right after this, I'm going to be jumping into some of the results. And I just want to mention that while we did originally survey these areas with hope of a very diverse group of people, so more rural, some urban, different land management ecosystems and actions, what we found was oftentimes there was not significant differences between the different groups we thought there might be. So most of our results are just for the combined 992 responses that we received. And then, of course, with surveys, this is not unusual. We predominantly had older. Our age group was predominantly older. Our average age was 66. Average income was middle class. They were predominantly Caucasian, again, given the area we were surveying, like rural Montana, not surprising. And they had an average education level of some college on that spectrum. So, and then I wanted to mention we did have a bonus study, because wait, there's more. So during one of my years of grad school, we got funded with a Graduate Research Innovation Grant, which is a joint fire science program grant specifically for grad students. And so this enabled us to do a longitudinal panel study for one site. And if you have no idea what that is, don't worry, I'll explain it. So what this is we took the same individuals from that first study and asked them some of the same questions, but 1 year after the initial study. And the reason we did this was because we wanted to study changes over time. And what happened in between those two survey points was this pretty active fire season in Northern California. Oh, and I should mention this was we only were able to do one of the 4 sites, and we chose Northern California because they had the pretty active fire season. I know that there was events that were smoking out communities to some degree. And this is a pretty uncommon natural resource social science tool to be able to talk to the same people at a different point in time. So when we got back, so again, we did the same method. We mailed it out, postcards, reminders. We had 61% response rate, so 146 people responded. Of course, these were people who had originally taken a survey a year before, so it's not surprising they were ready and willing to do it again. And so again, so 2012 was the initial survey. And then the summer happened with all the fire activity, and then we resurveyed again in 2013. So that's the bonus survey. And I do want to mention, I'll quickly go over what happened in that 2012 fire season. It's always strange when you're a social scientist because sometimes you want a pretty big action so that you can I wouldn't say I was hoping for fires, but I wanted something to happen so that we could have this stimulus effect. And we looked at the 4 sites, and California had one of the most active fire seasons compared to the other states for that 2012 fire season. A couple years later after this, these communities had issues from the rim fire with smoke, and they've had smokier years before that and after that. But for this year, there were about 3 large fires that were over 2,500 acres. These included the Ponderosa, Bagley, and Reading fire. And then there's a lot of really small fires, well, not really small to medium fires that were sending smokes that were pretty close to the communities we surveyed. And there were numerous examples of when there was, air quality warnings saying, hey, if you have kids, don't let them play outside today, or, even school closures earlier in the year. So, and then I just like this image because it kind of points. So as I mentioned, Reading was one of our surveyed areas, and you can see that they're this is August 24th of 2012. So the Bagley fire up there in the north, that was only 5% contained, so it kept burning after that. And then you have these different fires kind of encircling Reading. So depending on which way the wind was blowing, they were getting some smoke for about a week or 2 there. And so we also included a few questions of interest. Predominantly, these were the same questions so that we could do a comparison across time, but there's a couple of the things we really wanted to know. So of this group, 30% of them had some kind of respiratory ailment like asthma or COPD. Only 30% of them lived in a community with a community wildfire protection plan or a FireWise certification, which are communities that have taken actions to become more fire safe or FireWise. This can be things like the community has gone together and they've cleared out areas around their neighborhood, or they've taken actions around their own homes, like removing debris, so that if a fire did come through, it would be less likely, or even provide an area for firefighters to defend. You can look up FireWise. It's a great program. But so anyways, only 30% of the people said that they were part of one of those communities but 84 said that they thought it was likely a wildfire would happen in their home in the next 5 years. So I think that kind of the takeaway from this for me was that these respondents they were used to fire, they have dealt with fire, they expect to deal with fire and again, but there still seems to be some disconnect, and maybe it's, these populations, we can still do a better job of incorporating them into community wildfire protection plans or firewise programs. But it's not, so again, the biggest thing, fire is nothing new to them. It was not surprising that they probably had to deal with smoke yet another summer. So jumping into the results, so this was for the most part, these are going to be just from the first stage of this survey, so just the 4-state cumulative results, and I'll let you know when there was a difference between the two for the bonus survey, the GRIN-funded study. So for source of smoke, overall, we see that most people actually said that they could identify the source of smoke. And let me back up a little bit. So we know from previous studies that where the smoke is coming from, whether it's prescribed fire or wildfire, a pile burn, et cetera, can influence what people think of that smoke, specifically for us looking at acceptance. And so that, again, proved true with us. 57% said that, yeah, where the smoke is coming from does make a difference on acceptance. And then we were curious, do people think they actually know where the smoke is coming from? Just because you smell smoke doesn't always mean you know what type of fire, where it's coming from. And 71% of them said that, yes, they did know where the smoke was coming from, which was interesting. And I just mentioned that word social acceptability, so I wanted to take a minute and just mention what that is and why we care about it. So in general, when we're comparing different alternatives, we're deciding which are more favorable, and we're balancing kind of two sides of ourselves. We're balancing the affective ideals, which are emotions and values, and the more cognitive, which is knowledge or misknowledge even. And so we're kind of balancing this, between emotions and our knowledge, and that's kind of how we come to understand what is acceptable or not acceptable. And of course, there is a range of approval. This is all range of approval, so you're talking anywhere from tolerance to acceptance all the way to support. All those different words do have different intonations. And why does it matter to have a socially acceptable practice for something that's a public management organization? I'm sure most of you could probably answer this. A, because you have to. And B, it can lead to better agency public relations, which means less time and less money fighting the public. There's also an ethical and legal pull to instigate these publicly approved practices. And I know for a lot of people, it is mandated, and but there's also really good examples of how more collaborative efforts between the public, interest groups, and agencies result in better projects and in things that don't get held up in court. So that's a basic outline of social acceptability. And when we're talking about our survey, we just use the word acceptability and let them kind of self-define it. So moving on to acceptance of smoke. Since we know that the source of the smoke did matter, we asked them specifically if smoke was acceptable from all of these different sources. And when we're talking about wildfire, we added wildfire that is actively being suppressed, prescribed fire. So we did define these within the survey. And managed fire, what we're talking about, that is also sometimes known as a resource benefit fire, which is the idea that, or a naturally ignited fire that's allowed to burn, all those kind of leading to the same idea that a fire that's happening that they draw lines on and they allow it to burn to a certain area. We're just going to keep calling it managed fire. I know that term can change a little bit depending on who you work for, but that's what I'm going to be using for the rest of today. So going back to this chart, we also combined all of these into an all fire type acceptability. So that is what is at the top there. So in general, you can see that wildfire that's actively being suppressed is the most acceptable source of smoke. And then this cumulative all types of fire smoke is also fairly acceptable, followed by prescribed fire, and then the rest of them are a little bit lower. But you can also see that for agriculture, managed, pile, and private lands, all of those fires, it's not so much that they're not acceptable, it's that people were saying there was a higher percentage of people that were neutral about that. And then very few people mentioned don't know, so most people did have an opinion, which is good to note. And then so as I mentioned, we did that bonus survey. So this is just the California residents, respondents in 2012 and 2013. And interestingly, even with all those active fires and smokes going on, smoke events going on, there was not a significant difference between between the 2 years. No significant differences. I mean, you can see there's slight differences, but no significant differences. And it does remain that a wildfire that's being actively suppressed is still the most acceptable source of smoke for this group, even after that fire season. Another question we asked about was perceptions of smoke risk. So how we did this was we gave them a potential impact, like impacts of smoke to family health, and then we asked them, what is the likelihood that this would happen to you? And if it did happen, how severe would that impact be? And then we took those two and combined them together by multiplying them to get a smoke risk perception. So taking that into account, you can see that those health risks are they're the higher risk in comparison to all the way down. You go down to travel and ability to work outside. Those are the lowest risk. So keep this in mind just because this was one of the important factors for determining acceptability in our future models. So when I'm talking about risk perception, this is what I'm talking about, is this kind of combined factor of likelihood and severity for these different impacts. Another thing we did mention, we spent some time looking at agency relationships. And so we asked a number of questions about agencies, but this one I'm specifically looking at what this interval, or this measure we called confidence in agencies. And so this chart shows the percent of respondents that gave high ratings for the ability of an agency to achieve each of these actions: managing forests, managing smoke, and reducing fire risk. So this is what we call the agency confidence measure. And in most cases, we see that there's a slight, state agencies are slightly higher rated than federal, but overall about half the respondents, if not more, have confidence in agencies to achieve these three objectives, which is always encouraging to see. And you can also see that a couple of these have these red dots at the top there. And that just means that when we looked at the California subgroup for the resurvey, there was a slight but significant decrease in the agency's ratings to do all these activities except for the state to manage smoke. So just of interest there. So the next step we really wanted to look at was, we had all this big long survey and we were trying to figure out what was playing a role in smoke acceptance. So what we did is we ran a regression analysis and we looked at each source of smoke differently. So as you saw from that previous graph, the dependent variables were wildfire, prescribed fire, managed fire, pile burns, and burns on private lands, as well as agricultural burns, and then overall the fire acceptance combination that we put in. So that was, we tested each of those and saw which of these things we could plug in that would predict the ability of that model to, would predict the response of acceptability. So if you were accepting of prescribed fire smoke, what else did you have in common with other people that was similar? And so those were the independent variables, the factors that might influence smoke acceptance, and this was a wide range of things. Smoke risk, so those perceptions that I talked about earlier, that was kind of a complicated one, so I wanted to put that in there. If you had experienced previous impacts from smoke, either health or other, confidence in the agencies to manage smoke, which was from that graph I just showed, experience with communication sources regarding smoke, belief and benefits of prescribed fire, and knowledge about smoke. And then there was also a few demographic, like age, that were playing a role in whether or not you were accepting of smoke from these different sources. So the findings do get a little bit complicated, but there were some commonalities that I wanted to share with you. First of all, smoke health risk. So if you rated that you had a high risk of impacts from smoke that were related to health, or other impacts from smoke that you had a high risk of, as well as actually having experiences with impacts to health and other negative experiences, all of those, so basically health risk, risks and impacts, if you experienced or had a high risk factor, you were less likely to accept smoke from all the different fire types. So regardless of where the smoke was coming from, you were less likely to be accepting of that smoke if you had experienced health risk if you had experienced health impacts or had high risk of impacts from health or other smoke impacts. So I know that's kind of a lot there, but basically risk and impacts were the ones that across the board influenced acceptance negatively. And then ones that influenced it positively were agency competence and prescribed fire benefits. So if you agreed that prescribed fire had all this list of benefits we had, and if you had higher confidence in agencies to manage smoke, you were more likely to be accepting the smoke, again, from all sources, whether this is prescribed fire, managed fire, wildfire, et cetera. And then from there, we get into a lot of different specifics. So some variables that were not significantly, and I guess I didn't want to like spend all of the time going into each model and talking about what did and didn't influence it. If you want to do that, you could also email me after the presentation and I can send you the paper. It will have the table and you can go into depth with whatever smoke source you want. One other interesting cumulative result was that there was a few independent variables that did not connect with acceptance for any of the smoke sources, and those were communication experience, gender, and smoke knowledge. So those were not playing a factor in our models. And then also fires managed by agencies like wildfire, prescribed fire, managed fire were similar in what was causing what was related to their smoke acceptance. So they had similar correlated factors. And so one common defense of prescribed fire smoke is that, or prescribed fire burning is that smoke compared to wildfire, from a prescribed fire, those two are very different in their experiences. This is something I mentioned earlier, and this can increase the ability of wildfire suppression or even change the wildfire behavior if you're putting prescribed fire on the ground. So all these this is the, more smoke now, less smoke over the long-term trade-off was something that was really coming up in these models again. And because we asked a lot of questions about prescribed fire smoke, and this was related to what we had seen in the past, it wasn't surprising that of our models, the best prediction was for acceptance of smoke from prescribed fire. That was the model that performed the best overall. For the smoke sources of wildfire and private use burns, those models were a little bit less well explained, so there's definitely some factors we missed within our survey that we should consider for future surveys if we wanted to figure out what was causing acceptability of those particular sources. And that was stage 2. So I'm going to briefly go into stage 3 as well. I know we have about 20 minutes left here, and I do want to make sure there's time for questions. So stage 3 was an experimental design, and the idea here was that now we have all this information, how can we best frame messages to change how people are seeing smoke, and to basically how can we frame messages that are most effective? So what we did with that was we found a different group of people, and this was an online study, and so we sent them a pretest, and then we exposed them to it was 7 different messages, or 7 different combinations of messages, and then we sent them a post-test and saw how their 2 surveys were comparing pre and post-test, or pre and post exposure to the message. There's about 1,000 participants, and again, we were doing it in the same areas, but different sets of people, and there was about 45 participants for what we're calling a treatment. And so I'll get back into what a treatment is. Actually, I'll explain a little bit. So the treatments we had a couple of different factors we were trying to test, and so we mixed and matched all these and combined them into different options. And these were issues like risks, benefits, and then combining both risk and benefit of smoke and prescribed fire. There's more abstract ideas versus concrete. So, we're talking about pairing messages that were based on U.S. national connections versus more local, like statewide messages. And then we also had a control. And then for the analysis, it was ANOVA and post-hoc comparison and contrast. And again, there is a paper out on this, so I'll link to that so that you can kind of go more in depth if you're really into methods. And so the findings for this, majority of participants were actually female in this group. A fourth of them had experience with a fire in the last 5 years. More than 2/3 had a negative experience with smoke in the last 5 years. And then around a third had a member with someone in their house who had a respiratory ailment. Again, that's on par with what we know from our nationwide statistics too. About a third of people do have something that is made worse by smoke. And then a brief summary here of what these messages, and so basically, so again, we're having a pretest, we're exposing them to one of these different mixes of messages, and then we're seeing what changed afterwards. So in general, even for the control, when we expose people to any message, they were significant changes in a lot of these areas. So changes in there's increases in acceptance, increases in worry about wildfire specifically, increases in the belief about prescribed fire, which was that trade-off between less smoke compared to wildfires, and that there was more benefits to prescribed fire than there were costs or negative components, and an increase in knowledge both in what they had as current information and also the information they wish they had. And then we saw decreases in worry about prescribed fire, decreases in smoke emission health impacts for personal and household, expected harm, and then knowledge, there was a decrease in insufficiency. So that seems a little bit confusing, but that's, they originally thought that they didn't have enough knowledge, and then that thought decreased after being exposed to a message. So the general takeaway, we'll jump to some conclusions for this one, but the one that I think is most important is really that any information can help improve the views of smoke emissions, and it can increase the understanding. It does matter, the frame used for informational messages does depend on what you're trying to communicate. So, if you're trying to communicate about how great prescribed fire is, but you're just saying, fire is great, it's really not connecting with what you're trying to say. But in general, I wouldn't be as afraid about putting out messages, because it seems like if people are receiving that message, it is better than nothing. And then, so going into some more kind of specific conclusions, there was relatively high levels of concern and perceived personal impacts from smoke emissions, especially from people who were living in the wildland-urban interface. All messages, as I mentioned, resulted in all these benefits, increasing acceptance, beliefs, understandings, and then a decrease in that worry. Abstract messages, so the ones that were more big picture, were generally associated with more acceptance, lower perceived risk, and more understanding compared to other frames. And this was likely influenced by the fact that the audience had some prior knowledge and experience with fire and smoke emissions. And then finally, that the effectiveness increased by aligning messages and frames with communication goals. So as I just mentioned, knowing what you're trying to say and then aligning that with the correct frame or the correct messaging is important. But I really like the second one, which is all messages had some benefits. So one other thing that happened from this study was during the time that we were sending out these questionnaires, another group of researchers was doing a similar project where they were also sending out questionnaires with a little bit different focus, but we coordinated, and so we were able to include some of the same questions, which means after both of these studies were done, a team of people got together and combined the two data sets into one larger study. And again, there's a paper on this. It's called Characterizing Public Tolerance of Smoke from Wildfires in Communities Across the U.S., and it's by Ingridson. And so this was the study one, so that's what I'm going to call it, the one that I've just presented on, which was done to those two, Montana, Oregon, California, and South Carolina. And then additionally, they added another set of people from Montana. It was a different region, Louisiana, Texas, and Idaho. So cumulatively, all of these studies combined and all this data combined was about 2,900, almost 3,000 people, but with a very different gap in response rates. So it was Louisiana, I believe, that had the 6% response rate, and then all the way up to 30% for the top response rate. And there was, unfortunately, a little bit of differences in how we worded our questions. One of the biggest ones was that in our studies, we used the word acceptance, whereas the other studies, the Montana, Louisiana, Texas, Idaho, used tolerance. So we couldn't necessarily combine directly some of the questions, but we still were able to get general trends and kind of look at those. Oh, and we also had a little bit of a wording difference between how we defined a few of the fire types. So for example, we used a naturally ignited fire that's allowed to let burn, and the other study used something very similar but just slightly different wording. So again, we were careful when we were putting the two data sets together. So overall, what we found from combining these two was that wildfire did remain the most tolerable or acceptable in both the studies. So that's the wildfire that's actively being suppressed. Smoke from that was still the most acceptable. And then also smoke from a management ignited prescribed fires. So this is when we had the word changing. We said management ignited, or we said natural ignitions allowed to burn, aka managed fire, and they said management ignited prescribed fire. You can see it's pretty much similar, but we didn't want to combine things if they weren't asking the same question. And then more than 50% of respondents at all sites indicated acceptance of tolerance of smoke from all of those sources combined, with one exception, which was the Montana site from the second study, not the one we did. There was a significant difference in their acceptance of managed fire. Forest health objectives, so those prescribed fire benefits is what we called it, was continued to be a factor that increased tolerance and acceptance of smoke in both of the studies. So that was something that we found in both, which was important. Likewise, smoke from a natural ignition that was allowed to burn was significantly more tolerable when these prescribed fire benefits or forest health objectives were mentioned. And while acceptance of smoke from those sources was not extremely high, especially in some of the more private entity kind of burns, the tolerance of smoke was higher, which showed this kind of word difference. Acceptability versus tolerance might have been playing a role here. And then as far as when we combine these together, there was oftentimes no significant difference between states. In study 2, which was this new one they added, there was a few slight differences. So for example, managed fire in Montana, as I mentioned, was less acceptable than any other states. And then also there was a significant differences between the rural and urban people in the second study, again, for managed fire, but not for any of the others. So it seems like for most of these, when we combine these two, they were pretty similar in smoke acceptance, except for maybe that managed fire aspect. And then this paper also did a great analysis where they divided up into two groups. So they took all the people together, or all the respondents, and then if you had a previous health impact from smoke, you were put into group A, and if you did not have that, then you were put into group B, and then those were compared, and there were significant differences between these two groups. So if you had experienced smoke, you were less likely to be accepting of all the different fire types, even wildfire, prescribed fire, managed, flash pile, all of these. So this really does point to this idea that if you have an impact from smoke, you know, if you're not able to breathe because the smoke is just too heavy, or even with the risk of that, you are not going to be as accepting of smoke, which I'll get into a little bit later with some suggestions for that, because that is a hard thing to tackle. So getting into overall conclusions. What we learned was that there's at least moderate acceptance, and perhaps even a higher, when we're using the word tolerance, of smoke from most sources. And these lower acceptance levels are also affected by the fact that a lot of people were marking neutral. So there might be a potential audience in the future for that kind of targeted outreach. And the sources of smoke that seem more uncontrollable, like wildfires, oftentimes have a higher acceptance, because you can't say, oh, it's somebody's fault that there's smoke in the air. It's just what happens. They're doing their best to put it out. So that difference between why the fire and why the smoke is happening might be influencing acceptance. And it does appear that, as we know from previous research and from these studies combined, not only does the source of smoke does matter, but that when you are able to understand the benefits of why that fire is happening, you might be more accepting of smoke. And for the majority of questions asked, there were little differences between state and rural urban populations. A lot of times we have this narrative in our head that this state or this city versus this have very different opinions, but when it comes to smoke, that might not be as much of the case. And finally, the reiteration that stronger education relationships are really linked to not just smoke acceptance, but other perceptions. So that's something to focus on. And then I always want to have management implications, because I think science is great, but it doesn't really do much if it just sits on a dusty library shelf. So for many managers, smoke can present that barrier to getting fire back in the landscape. And so, just knowing that the majority of respondents, even though it's kind of a small majority, are at least neutral, if not accepting of smoke, is an important factor that can kind of help justify the continued use of this management tool. I know it's hard, and you probably hear from, the people, especially that third of people who maybe have health impacts who really don't want you to have a prescribed burn, but the majority of people are neutral, if not accepting of the practices you're doing. So that's encouraging. As far as what's making the smoke acceptable, it is a mixed factor. There's lots of different factors going into it, and some of these can't be influenced by managers. Again, if you have a health impact, there are some tactics we could take to try and explain the trade-offs between, the prescribed fire smoke and the wildfire smoke, but it might just be something we can't change. On the other hand, there are some factors that are kind of in the hands of agencies and NGOs and these work groups that we can put together. So the agency confidence is an important factor, especially when it comes to non-private land fire smoke, which makes sense. If you have confidence in the agency to manage smoke and to manage your forest, you're more likely to be accepting of the results of those actions, be it smoke or other. And these results also just suggest that there are some strategies that can be used through communication, to increase the belief and the knowledge about fire as a management tool, which I think as a country and as agencies, we've already done we're doing a good job, and it's a really hard uphill battle, but I think more and more people are starting to understand fire as a role in the ecosystem. And then once acceptance is increased, it does seem like, so for that, I'm looking at that specifically at that California study, because there weren't changes after that fire season, even with all the smoke, there weren't really significant changes in the acceptance of smoke from various sources. So that might be fairly resilient once you've built that up. Just one smoke season doesn't mean that it's all going to go downhill. It might keep a little bit even par. And then specifically management implications for communication. So it's always best to know your audience if you can, and really cater your message to them. But we have a lot of audiences, a lot of diverse backgrounds and ways to access information. So using a variety of strategies and tools can kind of be a little bit of a shotgun approach, especially when you're just trying to raise awareness about an action you're doing or why you're doing it, or can start a dialogue that can get into a better, more in-depth conversation. And then as far as message, of course, again, if you have a particular audience you're trying to reach, it's great to cater them specifically for them and use the tools that they are more familiar with. But in general, using a lot of kind of the shotgun approach, I would recommend. For message strategies, having a target messages that fits within a specific framework for the desired outcome. So not just, I know my audience is kids. I know kids are entertained by this, but then thinking about what message you want them to take home to their parents and catering your entire presentation or whatever you're doing with them around that and reiterating that and really bringing it home is an example of kind of fitting that within a framework. But again, if you're not sure of your audience, you're not sure of your framework, it seems from the third stage of this that any message that has good science, has good information, about smoke or about fire can lead to a positive perception change. So don't be too afraid. Better to say it and to start a conversation than to say nothing at all. It's also important to remember that about a third of the U.S. households do have some kind of respiratory ailment. And it was interesting, about a third of people from our studies also marked that they do, so that was right in line with the U.S. population. And when separated out in that joint analysis, people who had a health issue were less accepting of smoke regardless of where it was coming from. So really figuring out how to deal with this it's a large minority of people, but as I mentioned too, it's not just a nuisance. It can cause people to have hospitalization, illness, and even death. So it's not something we can ignore. And it might mean that from our side, from more of the management side, building that acceptance and some more supportive smoke with these trade-offs of prescribed fire versus wildfire. And then it also, might be that we need to extend our outreach groups and connect more with medical professionals and communities and be able to have better mitigation strategies for when smoke does come. So I live in the Bay Area now, and we had a lot of these smoke events coming from the Northern California fires, and people just had no idea about, how to close your windows, and that just because you're wearing a mask, if it doesn't have a specific qualification, it's actually going to make your breathing worse. All these things. So reaching out to more of the medical side of things. And also if your doctor is telling you, hey, we're doing prescribed, I know there's prescribed fire, here's things you can do, here's a smoke filter, but hey, hopefully it means that we'll have less wildfire smoke during the summer. Getting that messaging out through medical channels. I know there's a few examples here in California that's worked pretty well. It's definitely a new place to branch out to for many of us. And then also it's been suggested that looking at more positive messages rather than scare tactics can be beneficial. I think recently, whenever I go to a national park now, they don't say, don't walk on this just as a restrictive. They say, this is a biocrust and there's microbes living here, and it explains a little bit more and makes you want to help instead of just prohibits you from doing something. So having those more positive explanatory messages seems like a great way. Additional work, I'll just send links to this. So there is the Joint Fire Science Smoke Plan that's in the works. And then, as I mentioned, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is working on a smoke synthesis, specifically on social science. That's including about 36 articles that's summarized. And with that, I want to say special thanks. This is a pretty big team of people. And then a lot of different funders, especially the Joint Fire Science Program and the universities that hosted this team. So as you can see, it was across this both Oregon or OSUs were involved, as well as Forest Service and Joint Fire Science Program. I know I went a little bit over my time, Xander, but I'm happy to stick around if people have questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Stacey. That was a great presentation. You covered a lot of ground. And yeah, we can stay on here for a few minutes if folks have questions. Obviously, if you have to run to another meeting, we certainly understand. But we got a lot of folks on the phone line. So I think I'd like to take questions via the chat window. So if you can, good. Already have some questions popping in here. So Stephen asks, I've been interviewing fire managers on our forest for a public education story we're developing about prescribed fires. One of the thoughts that came out of the interviews was there's a generational divide or differing perspective when it comes to prescribed fires, in that there are a certain sector of the public that didn't grow up around prescribed fires and they don't accept the general premise, much less the smoke it produces. Stacey, what are your thoughts on that generational split? Did you see that in your data?
So most of the people we studied were over the age of 65. That was one of the biggest reasons why we ended up doing a non-bias check. So we called people, and they were oftentimes more in their 30s. And although we didn't find differences in a lot of the questions, we were really focused on like smoke acceptance. We were probably missing a lot of the younger generation. And I'm curious, when you're doing this, where are you doing this educational story developing? Is it in the South? I'll let you type your answer to that. And it's interesting too. I nowadays I get to go out and do some research with like K through 12, and the difference of doing it in an urban school where I can talk about how, when you start a campfire, here's what you do, and then saying that in an urban school where no one's even started a campfire, versus when I go out to more of a rural school, everyone's like, oh yeah, you want the tinder, and you want this, and this is why you do this, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Southwestern region, interesting. So, I think that is a good point. One of the things I guess I would recommend as far as outreach is if you need to start more from square one, one of the things that has been really successful for us is we have the tree ring data where we can hand kids, or even adults that have done this adult education too, hand them the tree ring, and they can count and see how frequent fire was occurring on that tree. So it's the tree rings where they have the cat face and the burn scars, so that you can count, every 9 years on average, this tree was being prescribed fire, or was being, in that case, more like a wildfire or a naturally ignited fire. And so you can really focus more on the ecosystem side of it, and talk about how it's affecting animals and wildlife and vegetation. And once people understand that it is a need, even though it has some negative benefits or some negative side effects like smoke, that it's a need for that specific ecosystem. That seems to help me. I'm not sure if that answered that question, but I specifically in this data did not see the generational divide, just because we didn't really have much of a generation difference. Hope that answers your question. Thanks for that.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we'll wait and see if other questions come in here. And maybe I'll go ahead and ask one. I guess I'm interested in some of the wording issues And as you mentioned sort of early on in your presentation, there's sort of an issue around how we describe management of naturally ignited wildfires that contributes to resource benefit. And based on some of the research and some of the nuances you saw, I mean, I was impressed that there's some fine detail between tolerance and acceptance. Do you have any insight into language around what we commonly call managed wildfire that either might add to public acceptance, or is it another one of your points as well? What really matters is opening the conversation.
It's a really interesting question. And we spent a lot of time trying to get the wordsmithing just right in the hopes, I feel like the wildland-urban interface is another great example of that. If you work in fire and you understand what the wildland-urban interface is, it makes total sense to you. But when you go out and you say that, like talking to a representative from the government, and you say WUI, or even if you say wildland-urban interface, it's really not the most descriptive of terms. So I think that when we are using whatever word choice we use, maybe focus less on using the word, and then always remembering when you're with a new audience to actually explain it. Most people I find want to say, hey, would you say what that acronym is, or would you explain that more, but they don't really want to feel like they're getting called out. So, I would rather have you use the wrong term even, and then explain what that means correctly, even if it seems repetitive, or even if someone seems like they don't need to hear it. It's almost, talking down isn't as bad of a thing as people make it out to be. 10 seconds of explaining that term versus having no idea and getting the wrong perception of what it is. Seems like it's worth the time to take to explain that. And specifically for managed wildfire, I think there's been 5 or 6 different terms, and I know I did a webinar a couple months back with somebody, and they called it managed wildfire, or maybe they said resource benefit fire, and somebody asked them to not use that term because all fires can have a resource benefit, and I think sometimes we get bogged down in the language, but better to have a dialogue and explain it. So, and if we have a better term for managed fire or naturally ignited fire that's allowed to let burn, or a resource benefit fire that encompasses all of those ideas without being politically incorrect, feel free to email me. So.
Great, thank you. Marlita has a question, and she asks, the aspect of not accepting smoke as readily for a prescribed burn not too surprising in the light of, quote unquote, someone to blame for the fire. And she's curious whether there's whether there is a difference between acceptance levels based on cause of a wildfire, human-caused or perceived management issues by the forest.
Yeah, so let me jump to a slide that might help with my explanation of that. Great question. So when I put these up, and I didn't want to write the entire term, but basically with this graph, the wildfire, that is a wildfire that is actively being suppressed. And so that could be human cause, or it could be naturally ignited cause. And then all the other ones, prescribed, agriculture, managed, pile burns, I guess maybe with the exception of managed fire, you could say that there is somebody who's making a decision on whether and how that fire is burning, whether it's starting that fire or allowing it to burn more. And so it is really, there is some human element into that. And specifically for the difference between an naturally ignited fire and a human-caused fire, I know within agencies, if it's a human-caused fire, they pretty much have to put it out in a lot of areas, whereas if it's a lightning strike, then they have the option, if a plan is in place, to allow it to burn to certain areas. So even within that regulation and structural, we kind of already have that difference designated between human and natural caused. And I'm trying to think if anybody has done a study about specifically, off the top of my head, I don't know if there's been a comparison between human and more natural causes. But yeah, I think that one of the reasons why this graph is showing there's less acceptance for those bottom ones is because there is a human decision element within there. So.
Great. Thank you. We'll give another second here to see if somebody types in another question, but I think we'll probably wrap it up here. So Stacey, I'll take the opportunity to thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time to present this. Certainly in work in our office here, smoke is a big issue, and I know you got good participation on this webinar because it's an interesting topic. So thank you for delving into it, and we'll look forward to sharing some of the papers in a follow-up email, and for the participants, we'll share a recording in case you have colleagues who would like to see this webinar and weren't able to attend, and that follow-up email will have either links or maybe the PDFs themselves for some of the papers Stacey mentioned.
Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thanks, Xander, for hosting. It was a pleasure.
Great, and I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. So hopefully we'll meet again on a future webinar. Thank you.
All right, thanks.